Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
This hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
It was 15 years ago today when the U.S. invaded Iraq. The war would go on to destabilize the Middle East and continues today. The invasion's repercussions will be felt for generations. Iraq remains a shattered country. We'll speak with an Iraq War veteran turned peace activist and a sociologist who studied the impact of the war on Iraqi women. Then, undocumented and unpaid, we go to Texas 6 months after Hurricane Harvey flooded Houston. Day laborers have faced rampant wage theft as they rebuild the city.
They divided my check into 3 to avoid paying me overtime.
Did you ask them for the overtime?
No, there are lots of people who don't say anything because they're afraid of stirring things up.
A new report by The Intercept documents how 2 Houston day laborers fought back and won after they worked weeks without pay for a major disaster recovery firm. We'll also look at FEMA's response to immigrants in Houston with U.S.-born children. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A Channel 4 News investigation in Britain has revealed executives from the company Cambridge Analytica boasting about entrapping politicians and launching fake news campaigns in order to sway elections around the world. The revelations come only days after it was revealed Cambridge Analytica harvested the data of more than 50 million Facebook users without their permission in efforts to sway voters to support President Donald Trump. Cambridge Analytica was founded by billionaire Robert Mercer and Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon of Breitbart News. On Monday, Channel 4 News broadcast videos it secretly recorded of Cambridge Analytica executives talking about entrapping politicians by sending women to seduce them or sending people posing as developers to propose a bribe. This is a clip of the Channel 4 News report in which the reporter went undercover posing as a potential client in order to reveal Cambridge Analytica's tactics. The video features Cambridge Analytica CEO Alexander Nix and executive Mark Turnbull, but it begins with narration.
Prepared, it seems, to ruin their clients' opponents through handouts and honey traps.
Send some girls around to Candy's house.
Through sex, secrets and spies.
I know people who used to work for MI5, MI6.
Old-style tactics wedded to the new.
We just put information into the bloodstream, to the internet, and then watch it grow.
The Channel 4 News expose comes as Facebook's stock plummeted Monday following the revelations about how Cambridge Analytica harvested its data in order to launch targeted political ads aimed at carrying out Robert Mercer's far-right political agenda and helping President Trump win the 2016 election. The reports have spurred calls for increased regulation of Facebook. A top executive is leaving Facebook amidst an internal dispute over how much to disclose to the public about how Russians use the platform to spread propaganda ahead of the 2016 election. Alex Stamos is Facebook's chief information security officer. The news of his impending departure this August comes as Facebook is now confronting a new firestorm about the Cambridge Analytica data breach. President Trump again called for the death penalty for drug dealers during a speech in Manchester, New Hampshire, Monday.
The ultimate penalty has to be the death penalty, unless you have really, really powerful penalties led by the death penalty for the really bad pushers and abusers. We are going to get nowhere, and I'm telling you, we are going to get somewhere.
Preliminary data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says more than 67,000 people died from drug overdoses last year. During Trump's speech, he also attacked the sanctuary city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, blaming the city for the spread of fentanyl in New Hampshire. A package destined for Austin exploded at a FedEx facility in Schertz, Texas, northeast of San Antonio overnight. The package was filled with nails and pieces of metal. Early reports indicate no FedEx workers were seriously injured in the explosion. Authorities are investigating whether the failed package bomb is related to the serial bombings across Austin, which have killed 2 members of prominent black families and injured 6 others since the first bombing on March 2nd. Authorities said Monday that the 4th explosion Sunday night was set off by a tripwire, indicating a higher level of sophistication. Police are investigating whether the bombings are hate crimes, with 2 people killed, members of prominent African-American communities in Austin, a 17-year-old teenager and a 39-year-old man. In Washington, D.C., activists have laid 5,000 flowers onto the lawn of the U.S. Capitol to symbolize the 5,000 Yemeni children who've been killed or injured in the ongoing U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign in Yemen. The protest comes as the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is slated to arrive in Washington, D.C. today to meet with President Trump. On Monday, activists called on lawmakers to support a new bipartisan resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 54, to end the U.S. military involvement in Yemen within 30 days, unless Congress formally authorizes the military action. This is activist Iram Ali.
This is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world right now, and it is still ongoing when it can be stopped with just passing this legislation and allowing humanitarian aid in.
The bipartisan legislation could be voted on as early as today. In Syria, residents are continuing to flee the northwestern city of Afrin amidst reports of widespread looting by Turkish and Turkish-backed troops who seized control of the Syrian Kurdish city on Sunday. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has now vowed to continue the Turkish military offensive against other Kurdish-controlled areas in northwestern Syria.
Dün Afrin şehir merkezine
After controlling the city center of Afrin yesterday, we completed the most important phase of Operation Olive Branch. Now we will continue this process with Munbij, Ain al-Arab, and Ras al-Ain, and Kamishli, until we remove all of this corridor.
Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been taken into police custody for questioning amidst an investigation into whether he received millions of euros in illegal campaign financing from the late Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi in 2007. Sarkozy has repeatedly denied the allegations. Back in the United States, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, and other experts hosted a live-streamed town hall Monday night on inequality in America, the rise of oligarchy and collapse of the middle class. During the discussion, economist Derek Hamilton spoke about the intersections of race, education, and class.
We know that if you are a head of household and you're black, and you graduated from college, your family's wealth position is lower than that of a white family where the head dropped out of high school. So this feeds into the narrative of, can we simply work hard, study hard, and address inequality? The answer is no. Those things are important. Education is important in its own right. So when Senator Sanders proposes that we should have tuition-free public education, absolutely. But as an end unto itself, we exaggerate the economic returns to education, particularly for marginalized groups. And when we start getting into these narratives of a post-racial society, we're not there. Now, we can come up with comprehensive programs that include everybody, but we need to do it differently this way so that we make sure nobody is left behind.
Monday night's town hall came as a landmark new study shows rich white boys are likely to remain rich as adults, but that rich black boys are more likely to become poor or middle class as adults. The study, led by researchers at Stanford, Harvard, and the Census Bureau, debunks widely held ideas about income inequality and race. It shows how racism still deeply affects African-American men's lives, even if they grow up in the country's richest neighborhoods and have high levels of education. The study also reveals the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system, showing how black men who were raised by millionaires are just as likely to be incarcerated as white men who are raised in poor households. The Supreme Court has rejected a Republican appeal to block the redrawing of Pennsylvania's congressional map. The Pennsylvania State Supreme Court ruled the congressional map unconstitutionally favored Republican candidates and ordered it redrawn. The new, more equitable map is expected to offer a boost to Democratic candidates during the 2018 midterm elections. In Arizona, a self-driving Uber car killed a pedestrian Sunday night in Tempe, leading Uber to quickly suspend its self-driving tests in Tempe, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, and Toronto. Sunday night's fatal crash occurred despite the fact that there was an emergency backup driver, a human, sitting behind the wheel. The pedestrian is believed to be the first person to be killed in association with new self-driving technology. The actress Cynthia Nixon has officially entered the race for governor of New York. She'll be challenging New York Governor Andrew Cuomo in the Democratic primary later this year. And Mississippi Republican Governor Phil Bryant has signed into law one of the most restrictive anti-abortion laws in the country, banning abortions after 15 weeks, even in the case of rape or incest. The Center for Reproductive Rights has sued Mississippi over the ban, calling it unconstitutional. Lawsuits by the center have blocked similar laws in Arizona, North Dakota, and Arkansas in recent years. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. It was 15 years ago today when the U.S. invaded Iraq on the false pretext that Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction. The attack came despite worldwide protest and the lack of authorization from the United Nations Security Council. At around 5:30 a.m. in Baghdad on March 20th, 2003, air raid sirens were heard as the U.S. invasion began. Within the hour, President George W. Bush gave a nationally televised speech from the Oval Office announcing the war had begun.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
6 weeks later, on May 1st, 2003, President Bush landed on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln off the coast of San Diego and declared the end of major combat.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Well, the fighting has yet to end, and the death toll may never be known. Conservative estimates put the Iraqi civilian death toll at 200,000, but some counts range as high as 2 million. In 2006, the British medical journal Lancet estimated 600,000 Iraqis died in just the first 40 months of the war. The U.S. has also lost about 4,500 soldiers in Iraq and some more than 22,000 wounded. Just last week, 7 U.S. service members died in a helicopter crash in western Iraq near the Syrian border. The war in Iraq has also destabilized much of the Middle East. Former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan and others have directly blamed the U.S. invasion of Iraq for the rise of ISIS.
To talk more about the 15th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, we're joined by 3 guests. Zahra Ali is a French-Iraqi sociology professor here in the United States at Rutgers University. Her forthcoming book is titled Women and Gender in Iraq, Between Nation Building and Fragmentation. Ali grew up in France. Her parents were Iraqi political exiles. Matt Howard is co-director of About Face, Veterans Against the War, the organization formerly known as Iraq Veterans Against the War. He served in Iraq once in 2004, again in 2005. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Ali, let's begin with you. 15 years ago today, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Talk about what happened then and the repercussions today.
I mean, first of all, I would like to say, that as a daughter of an Iraqi political exile family who grew up in France, I, refused. I was 16 years old at the time of the war, and I refused this false dilemma: either you oppose the regime, either you oppose the war. I opposed the regime, and we had to flee Iraq because of the authoritarian regime, and also I got involved in the anti-war movement in France. And also, we have to name the war. We have to name it as, a criminal war. And we have to, define it as, the very operation of the destruction of Iraq as a functioning state and society. And this operation has started before 2003, has started in 91. I mean, if we talk about U.S. interferences in the region, and in Iraq in particular, we can go back to the 60s. But at least for this specific operation, we have to talk about 91. The U.S.-led coalition bombing, or criminal bombing, devastating bombings of Iraq that were described as, surgical strikes, but that, targeted water and electricity supplies, bridge, schools, hospitals, and left the country in a humanitarian crisis. And then, after this terrible situation, the imposition of the UN sanctions, that were terrible for the Iraqi population, and that were, very much initiated and pushed by the US administration of the time. So a country that needed to be reconstructed was plunged into a deep humanitarian crisis that destroyed its middle class, weakened to an extreme level its state's institution and infrastructures. So we had, before the sanction, a free and strong education system, a good healthcare system, so a functioning state. And then, so this is the situation, that characterized Iraq in 2003 when the invasion happened. So the Iraqi society had already been brutalized by decades of wars and by the normalization of political violence, of course, the repression of all the different uprisings of the population in the north and in the south, and social, economic, and humanitarian crisis. And I want to say that, the US invasion exacerbated the situation, this crisis, to its extreme. First of all, in destroying what was left of the states, its institutions and services that provide basic human needs to the society, that makes a functioning society, so access to running water, electricity, a welfare state. And it was done through what was called the debassification campaign, so that disbanded the army and part of the administrative basis of the regime. And also, something that is very important and that we have to, remind ourselves to understand what is going on today, the rise of ISIS, etc., is that the US administration created a political system based on what I call in my research ethno-sectarian quota. In other words, is to say that the US administration has institutionalized racism in Iraq. So it has created a political regime that, relies on communal-based identity. So in Iraq, in 2003, since 2003, you are not just a political leader defined by your belief, your political belief. So as a communist, a nationalist, an Islamist, you are an Arab political leader, a Kurdish political leader, a Sunni, Shi'i, or Christian political leader. And this really is at the core of what, provoked the social, ethnic, and sectarian fragmentation and the sectarian war in the country. As well, we have to say that the U.S. administration brought to power a political elite that, had mainly lived in exile since, for example, for some of them, since the 80s, so very much disconnected with the realities on the ground. And even for those political exile who had some legitimacy, some political legitimities inside the country, I mean, they have lost this legitimacy because they have proved to be extremely sectarian, extremely conservative, and extremely corrupted as well. So,
if we can, I'd like to bring in Sami Rassouli, who is the founder and director of the Muslim peacemaker teams in Iraq. He lives in the Iraqi city of Najaf, and he moved back to Iraq in 2004 after living abroad for nearly 30 years. He left Iraq in the late 1970s and eventually moved to the United States and settled down in Minneapolis. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Could you talk about your thoughts now, 15 years after President Bush declared mission accomplished, what the situation in Iraq is today?
Thank you for having me for your wonderful show. Warm greetings from Iraq, and again, 15 years. 15 years and the immeasurable tragedy continues to unfold. So disaster's anniversary keeps slapping us on the face, asking whether we have learned anything from that tragedy. Well, George Bush was one of the worst presidents, but yet today some people think what we have currently is really bad and George Bush in comparison better. So Iraq entered in a tunnel in 2003 with no light at the end, from the invasion to occupation to sectarianism, then terrorism, ISIS, and we should not forget about Iranian expansion in Iraq. Well, just recently, some partial solution the Kurds and Arab reached. Otherwise, we've gone in another tunnel of conflict between the North and the South. We don't know. Iraq is right now going in a decrease of education level, healthcare quality, security, the worst in the world. Iraq is considered because borders are widely open. The Iraqi army is not yet capable to keep Iraq safe. There are many military bases have been built by the U.S. and is still building, increasing from, I believe, last year 7. Now we have about 12. So, unfortunately, Iraqi people are paying heavily price, but we're not going to continue to cry about what's going on. As a Muslim peacemaker team, been working since 2005 now in form of outreach and advocacy for peace and promoting the principles of peace building across the country between all factions, regardless whether they are Kurds, Arabs, Sunni, Shia, Muslims, or Christians. Right now, we're hosting 2 Americans from New Jersey, Mr. Missler, and from Wisconsin, Ms. Strobel, who are helping in a project that MPT, Muslim Peacemaker Team, started last October by inviting Americans to meet Iraqis, and the project is called English for Reconciliation. I started the school, as I said, about 6 months ago, trying to bring from so-called infidels from the West to meet so-called terrorists in the East, in Iraq mainly, according to the American mainstream media, to meet around on a round table, break the bread together, see in the eyes, and they find out nothing of that nonsense is true. They are nothing but brothers and sisters, meeting, belonging to the same human race, and striking agreement by establishing lasting friendship that's based on respect, mutual understanding, and trust.
Sammy, we're having a little trouble understanding you, but I want to thank you for being with us from Najaf, Iraq. Sammy Rassouli was an institution in Minneapolis, had Sinbad's Restaurant, was on the cover of Minneapolis Magazine, but left everything to return to his country at the height of the war, to be with his countrymen and women and family. Sami Rassouli, founder of Muslim peacemaker teams in Iraq, speaking to us on this 15th anniversary of the U.S. invasion. When we come back, we'll continue with our guests, Zahra Ali, who is a sociologist, a professor at Rutgers, and Matt Howard of About Face, Veterans Against the War, served in Iraq in 2004 and 2005. Stay with us.
There are mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers crying. They're only pawns in your play of power and corruption. Slowly starve them of your new weapon of mass destruction. And prove to me, America, that you care. And prove to me, America, you're aware. Who's dying for your freedom in this land? Who pays the cost for the liberties you demand?
Over fear.
Is it for freedom or a comfort and convenience?
Is It for Freedom by Sarah Thompson. In that piece, you hear Medea Benjamin of Code Pink interrupting Congress protesting the war. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As we continue our look at the 15th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, we're joined here in New York by two guests.
Zahra Ali is a sociology professor at Rutgers University. Her forthcoming book is titled Women and Gender in Iraq, Between Nation Building and Fragmentation. She grew up in France. Her parents were Iraqi political exiles. We're also joined by Matt Howard, a co-director of About Face, Veterans Against the War, the organization formerly known as Iraq Veterans Against the War. He served in Iraq once in 2004, then again in 2005. I'd like to begin with Matt. Talk about your first deployment, your sense at the time of what the Iraq War was about, and your own evolution in terms of your understanding of the war.
Certainly. Yeah, so when I was deployed, well, first off, I watched the invasion from Okinawa, Japan, where I was stationed at the time, and had a real kind of gnawing sense of dread that we were making a decision we could never step back from. A year later, I was stationed in Iraq outside of Fallujah in support of helicopters that were doing casualty evacuation. And I think an experience that really crystallized for me where I really went down a path of challenging everything that had been told to me was when we were guarding Iraqi men who are laborers that were coming onto our forward operating base, who basically spelled out everything Zahra said, that their lives had measurably, the quality of life had taken a dramatic hit, and that everything that we're being told in terms of our hearts and minds and how we're going to make this place better is far from the truth as could possibly be.
Why did you end up going to Iraq? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Portland, Oregon. Mm-hmm. So I joined the Marine Corps when I was 17, so before I finished high school, and that was before September 11th. And I deployed, or I went to boot camp about a month after September 11th.
And, what of the casualty numbers for Iraq, given the length of the war, don't appear on the American side to have been that great, 4,500 soldiers. But when you think of the more than 22,000 who were injured as well, many of those soldiers injured would have in previous wars died, but not for the miracle of science and medicine. But many have survived with lifelong injuries of amputated limbs and traumatic shock and brain damage. Can you talk about the impact on the soldiers for this constant warfare, because obviously they never were able to win the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's something that we talk about that's a hallmark of this war, which is both the way that deployments occurred many times for some folks, sometimes as many as 10 times, and also the kind of invisible wounds of the war, as you were mentioning, whether that's post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, or military sexual trauma, that are often not tallied in the kind of figures that we have for these things. And just want to make it clear that if that goes for the military, that very definitely goes for the Iraqi civilians that are continuing to deal with the after effects of this war. I think that one thing that we've noticed is just that that people are also coming home to an underfunded VA, and a VA that's under attack now by the Trump administration, that there is a real mission to privatize it. So all of this kind of rhetoric of taking care of our troops is very quickly diminishes depending on people's political priorities.
When did you make your about face, Matt?
Good question. I mean, it could have been in a few different places. I think that I joined About Face when it was IVAW in 2008, so about a year after I came home. And it was actually an anti-war protest. There was the Winter Soldier hearings, and a friend of mine
the Winter Soldier hearings outside of Maryland, if you could explain what they were.
So the Winter Soldier hearings were a moment when our community got together to really testify to the costs of war, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And to let the American people what was being done in their name.
And Professor Ali, I'd like to ask you in terms of the cost of war. Last week we had a segment on the Vietnam War where we talked about the long-lasting damage in Vietnam from Agent Orange, from the birth defects that occurred as a result of the Agent Orange, the herbicide spraying in Vietnam. What about this whole issue of depleted uranium and the impact on the environment of Iraq and the use of the weapons of the U.S. troops in Iraq that the civilian population is still dealing with?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that, and thank you as well. Yes, I mean, you mentioned Fallujah, and it's, I mean, now known that, depleted uranium was used in Fallujah, and, it was a criminal war, it was a dirty war
and
as
white
well.
phosphorus.
Yeah, and the effect for the Iraqi population in Fallujah and elsewhere is actually, it goes even, through generations, when you think of the use of all the chemicals, etc. And we are still, I mean, perhaps, U.S. soldiers can go back to their country, but, we are still in the middle of the war. We live, the war. And I don't know any Iraqi household, including my household, that hasn't been directly affected by a form of violence, that hasn't, witnessed a car explosion, that hasn't, lost a member of their family. I mean, it's the current reality. And now when you think about, the invasion of ISIS and the very, militarization, of the society and the militarization of the public spaces. So, for example, if you take Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, I mean, we have to have this image in mind when we talk about it, is the capital is divided, fragmented by checkpoints and concrete T-walls, that divide the neighborhood according to sectarian, religious, ethnic belongings. So even, and I talk about it when I talk about women and human rights in general, in my research in Iraq, when you want to circulate in Baghdad, you have to, every kilometer, pass through an armed male soldier, a checkpoint. So even the population of Baghdad, 65% of the population of Baghdad itself, has been, displaced either in Baghdad or in Iraq or outside Iraq.
Professor Ali, you write in your Washington Post piece about a proposed constitutional amendment which would have a massive effect on women.
Yeah, so it's not a constitutional amendment because actually the Article 41 is in the Constitution. So what happened is that since 2003, I mean, there have been several attempts made by sectarian, conservative Islamist parties that came, to power with the U.S. Army to question along sectarian lines, the very basis of women's legal rights, expressed and enacted in, what is called the Personal Status Code, so the family law, that gathers all laws and legislations related to marriage, divorce, inheritance, custody, so most of women's legal rights. So this Personal Status Code was adopted at the end of the 50s in 1959 in Iraq, and it's very important to recall that it's really the produce of the political culture of the time that was dominated by the anti-imperialist left. The Iraqi personal status code at the time was one of the most progressive personal status code in the region, right? And it was structured by two things. The participation of women's rights activists in its drafting, somebody like Naziha Delaimi, the first Iraqi and Arab women's minister, participated to its drafting. And the second dimension that is very important to understand what is going on now is that it still gathers a Sunni and Shi'i like Muslim jurisprudence. So it has a unifying, dimension. And this is I think, the political legacy that is being questioned since 2003. So we had it with the Decree 137, then now we have it in the Article 41. But thanks to feminists, women's rights, civil society mobilization, the Article 41 is still not implemented. But still, under the name of this article, we had so many, law propositions made by conservative, sectarian Islamist parties that are in power since 2003. The Ja'fari law, for example, in 2014, and just a few months ago.
Ja'fari law is?
The Ja'fari law is a proposition that would allow the existence of a family law based on the Ja'fari madhab, so school of law. And among the things that are problematic and that represent, a regressive thing for women's rights is that it allows very informal forms of unions in which women do not have legal protection. It can, if ever implemented, lower the age of marriage as early as 9 years old for girls. So this is the kind of things, this is the kind of questioning of women's legal rights that is made. But I also want to make a point here is that we tend to approach women's rights in a very, I think, simplistic manner, or as if it was a very abstract thing, just as democracy, it's a value or whatever. No, it is very concrete stuff when we talk about democracy or the right to vote. If you think of the right to vote, that is of course essential for women and all citizens. You also have to have the structural context that allow people to go to the voting site without being scared of being shot or kidnapped, right? And you have for women to have a functioning state institution, childcare, healthcare, education, access to the job market, and as well, when we talk about the post-2003 situation, although the militarization had already started under the regime with the different wars in the 80s, but now we have really reached an extreme. So militarization really defines, gender norms and relations, towards masculinist ways of defining, malehood, and that idea that, women need protection and men are the protector, of women. And these are very important dimensions to keep in mind.
I wanted to turn to Matt to ask you about the many people, as we've mentioned, have blamed, especially in the latter period of this U.S. Intervention in Iraq, the rise of ISIS as a direct result of the U.S. invasion, and especially of the attempt of the initial administrators of Iraq, the coalition, in terms of rooting out all of the Ba'athist leaders throughout the entire governmental structure, removing them from civil service, dismantling the military, and basically destroying the existing institutions of Iraq. Right. I'm wondering what your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that...
And what you saw directly. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I was there in 2004 and 2005, and obviously the rise and emergence of ISIS is significantly further down the line. But I think that it's pretty clear that all blame that can be laid to is that the U.S. government and U.S. militaries really can be laid into its lap around the emergence of ISIS. And, part of that is just that for this pure simple fact that the leadership met each other in coalition prison-run facilities. They had essentially cut their teeth during the occupation of Iraq. Were fighting U.S. forces, occupiers there, and that and were politicized and found themselves obviously in positions in Syria and other places. I think that if anything, it points to the U.S.'s role in destabilizing the region, in the after effects that we're seeing right now, throughout throughout the Middle East and Central Asia.
I wanted to turn to Tony Blair, right? October 2015, the former British Prime Minister speaking to Fareed Zakaria on CNN, saying there were, quote, elements of truth to the claim that removing Saddam Hussein played a part in the creation of ISIS.
You can't say that those of us who removed Saddam in 2003 bear no responsibility for the situation in 2015. But it's important also to realize, one, that the Arab Spring, which began in 2011, would also have had its impact on Iraq today. And two, ISIS actually came to prominence from a base in Syria and not in Iraq.
And to the other world leader responsible for the U.S. invasion, that was former President George W. Bush. In 2010, in his first major interview since leaving the presidency, Bush spoke to NBC's Matt Lauer, before he was fired, about the Iraq War.
So by the time you gave the order to start military operations in Iraq, did you personally have any doubt, any shred of doubt about that intelligence?
No, I didn't. I really didn't.
Not everybody thought you should go to war, though. There were dissenters.
Of course there were.
Did you filter them out?
I was a dissenting voice. I didn't want to use force.
Your words. No one was more sickened or angry than I was when we didn't find weapons of mass destruction. You still have a sickening feeling.
I do.
When you think about it.
I do.
Was there ever any consideration of apologizing to the American people?
I mean, apologizing would basically say the decision was a wrong decision, and I don't believe it was a wrong decision.
If you knew then what you know now,
that's right,
you would still go to war in Iraq.
I, first of all, didn't have that luxury. You just don't have the luxury when you're president. I will say, definitely, the world is better off without Saddam Hussein in power, as are 25 million people who now have a chance to live in freedom.
As are 25 million people who now have a chance to live in freedom. That's former President George Bush speaking in 2010. Zahra Ali, you return home to Iraq a couple times a year. Your parents, political dissenters. Interesting that George Bush described himself as a dissenter. Your response both to Bush and to Blair?
Well, I mean, again, this terminology, all this use, of this vocabulary, in the UK, in the US, it was a mistake, whatever. It was a crime. Come on. It's a criminal war, and these people, have to be judged for their crimes, right? But also, I want to say something about, this narrative about democracy, etc., is that, the post-2003 Iraqi regime has proven, to be very anti-democratic. And when we think of the context of the invasion of ISIS and, what happened around it, we have also to talk about the fact that in Iraq, despite the very terrible situation, we do have very strong social movements. We do have, citizens, more recently, since 2015, we have like a very strong grassroots popular movements that, question the very legitimacy of the post-2003 regime, women's rights activists, involved, in that movement. But the situation is that, in a way that is kind of comparable to here, is that this war on terror narrative is really, used to justify any kind of, repression, any kind of silencing of, radical political activism in the country, right?
Well, we want to thank you both for being with us. Matt Howard of About Face, Veterans Against the War, and also Zahra Ali, who is a sociology professor at Rutgers, a French-Iraqi woman who is writing a book right now on Iraqi women, her forthcoming book. And feminist activists, Women and Gender in Iraq, Between Nation Building and Fragmentation. Zahra Ali grew up in France, her parents Iraqi political exiles. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, what has happened to the undocumented workers who are rebuilding Houston, undocumented and unpaid? Our own Democracy Now!'s Renee Feltz will bring us a report. Stay with us.
Take that waving flag off of your door. Don't act like you understand what we've been fighting for. Take that fake concern appreciating me for all that I've done wrong, and take that yellow ribbon off your car. You think that I went to liberate, so when I come home you celebrate. But you can't bring back the dead by throwing a parade. You tell me I made my nation proud. I wish you wouldn't say it so damn loud. My boots were on the ground while your head was in the clouds. So take that yellow ribbon off your car. Don't pay for my meal, don't give me special deals, unless you want to hear all about the way I feel. Don't make me your hero, just lend me your ear, oh, and wipe the tears I cry. Well, I apologize for that goddamn yellow ribbon on your car.
Yellow Ribbon by Emily Yates, a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War. She says she wrote the song after speaking with fellow veterans about the yellow ribbon magnets people put on their cars. Yates was deployed twice to Iraq, where she served in the 3rd Infantry Division as an Army Public Affairs Specialist from 2002 to 2008. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to Houston, the nation's 4th largest city, where Hurricane Harvey dumped more than 50 inches of rain 6 months ago. After the storm, tons of moldy debris had to be removed. Now the city is beginning a multi-year rebuilding process, much of the work being done by undocumented immigrants who make up at least half of the Texas construction workforce. But even as their work is in high demand after the storm, many are facing widespread wage theft. Few of them report the abuse because they fear deportation if they go to the police. Just last week, the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld much of the state's so-called show me your papers law that allows police to ask anyone in their custody their immigration status. This is a Houston day laborer named Adrian who spoke to The Intercept. He is a Mexican immigrant who says he worked 60 hours per week but only got paid for 40.
They divided my check into 3 to avoid paying me overtime.
Did you ask them for the overtime?
No. No, there are lots of people who don't say anything because they're afraid of stirring things up.
Se les voltean las cosas. Si en eso no hubieran apoyado la SB4.
If they hadn't supported SB4, things would be different because a lot of immigrants aren't reporting anything for this reason.
Undocumented immigrant workers like Adrienne lost thousands of dollars due to wage theft after Hurricane Harvey. But some have fought back and won their paychecks by pressuring one of the nation's largest disaster recovery firms with help from labor advocates. To learn more, we're joined by 2 guests. In Houston, Mauricio Iglesias, also known as Chele, the community organizer for the Workers' Defense Project in Houston. And here in New York, Renee Feltz, longtime Democracy Now! Producer, award-winning reporter. Her latest story for The Intercept is headlined, Amid Rampant Wage Theft in Post-Harvey Reconstruction, Immigrant Workers Take on Disaster Recovery Giant and Win. Last November, she reported on how immigrant day laborers confront a perfect storm of exploitation and Hurricane Harvey cleanup. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Renee, you're just recently back from Houston. Describe what you found.
Thanks so much, Amy and Juan. I was curious to find out about the conditions for people who are rebuilding Houston. 50 inches of rain fell on the city. First, a lot of the buildings had to be mucked out, as they called it, cleaned out, the mud, the debris, the mold. Then they had to be rebuilt, and that process is going to take a long time. So I wanted to see who's rebuilding, and it's mostly undocumented immigrant laborers. And what I found to be especially interesting is that their labor is in high demand. We just described a situation in Houston. We also know that there were storms in Florida, Puerto Rico, the fires in California, a lot of reconstruction to be done. And yet these workers who jobs were everywhere, were often not getting paid for the work that they did. And part of the reason for that, as we mentioned in the introduction, is because Texas has what they call a sort of show me your papers law. When people go to police, they might be afraid that police can ask them about their immigration status. So even though it's a crime not to pay a worker, even if they're undocumented, these workers weren't going to police to report it. Now, we call this undocumented and unpaid, but another way to say it is undocumented and unpaid until now. When I went to Houston recently, I was interested to learn of some sort of good news. Two workers that I met with Chile, named Carla and Hector, were working on rebuilding an apartment complex north of Houston, and they ended up working several weeks and not seeing a paycheck. They inquired about it. They asked, when am I going to get paid? They were being paid in cash. And even Carla was injured at some point. And when she went to the hospital, she needed that cash from what she had worked to help pay for her bills. The company, the subcontractor, wasn't paying her. And so they sought help. She sought help from a lawyer who said, I can't do anything for you. Essentially, she felt like she had no rights. Even though she had just worked all these weeks. Maybe Chile can pick it up from here to tell us what happened, when they turned to a new foothold in Houston of the Workers' Defense Project.
Yes.
Good morning, Amy. No.
Go ahead, Chile.
Good morning, Renee and Juan. What happened is that Hector reach out through me, through social media, and he wanted to know what we can do to help him. He was not getting paid for several weeks, and at first he talked to me. He did not trust me at first, but then when I spoke to him and we met and told him what Workers' Defense Project is, he became acquainted with us, and we gained his trust. We were able to help Hector and Carla by eventually filing liens against the apartment buildings, and we were able to recover their wages.
An amazing success. I wanted to return to a related report, Renee, that you produced for Democracy Now! About how FEMA responded to immigrants in Houston after Hurricane Harvey.
Half a year after Hurricane Harvey, many homeowners who faced heavy flooding are still recovering with little or no help from FEMA, especially immigrants. To talk to some of them, I meet up with Chele, an organizer with the Workers' Defense Project.
You can still see like a lot of mud, on the streets.
He takes me to a working-class neighborhood built near the intersection of the waterways of Greens Bayou and Halls Bayou.
So this is like the bayou nearby?
We drive down streets named Lake Forest Boulevard and Lake Park Drive.
Most of the homeowners here, they are construction workers or working general labor. Many undocumented, particularly, have bought homes in here because, the prices, were low, but now they're going to sink and they're going to be under the water again.
Some of the houses still look destroyed from flooding, with visible water lines. They're interspersed with fully restored houses and others in various states of repair. One of the first residents we meet is Alma, an immigrant from Mexico, who shows us her house that flooded with 3 feet of water during the storm.
Everything got damaged. Beds, fridge, stove in the living room, everything. We threw everything away.
Is the house damaged still, or is it fully repaired?
It's so-so, because we just fixed 2 bedrooms where my 15-year-old daughter and me and my husband sleep, and the kitchen.
We're curious if people have heard from FEMA and what that experience was like.
Oh yes, they helped. It took a long time, but they did help us, thank God, and the inspectors were nice to us.
Alma tells us they used a gift card from her church to buy drywall and insulation so her husband could start to repair the house before their FEMA check arrived.
Was the inspector bilingual?
¿El inspector era bilingüe?
Hablaba poquito español.
He spoke a little bit of Spanish, but not much.
Down the street from Alma, we stopped to look at one of many houses that seem abandoned at first.
I remember this home. It was missing part of the front wall. Now it looks like it's covered by wood, and there's a new door. I looked inside, and there's no walls. There's just the 2x4s. It looks like there are things like someone is living there. According to FEMA, they are saying that these homes are habitable. You know, the way they look, they don't look habitable to me or to any human being.
Across the street, we meet a man named Ricardo, a Mexican immigrant who's unloading construction material from his van into his house, which flooded with more than a foot of water during Hurricane Harvey. I ask him what was damaged.
Prácticamente todo. Tuve que remover
practically everything. I had to remove 4 feet of sheetrock from the floor.
Can you tell us what happened when FEMA came?
Really, they never came. Really, I only spoke with them once on the phone, and they asked me for my Social Security and said there was no help for those who don't have a Social Security.
Can he describe the impact of not having FEMA help?
Para mí es lo mismo.
He says that for him, it feels like it will be the same because there are other people who are much worse than him and have gotten aid, and they're still, not fully recovered, and they're, at a worse state. But when he's been hurt, economically, ¿cómo económico? ¿Cómo es sus ahorros?
Pues mis ahorros.
Okay.
Prácticamente.
So his savings, he spent many of his savings away in recovering.
Y haciendo yo mismo el trabajo.
And doing the work himself.
After we leave Ricardo, we go around the corner to meet Jocelyn Ramos, an immigrant from El Salvador who moved back into her house not long after it suffered heavy flooding from Harvey. She lives there with her husband, 2 relatives, and her children, 8-year-old son Gerardo and 3-year-old daughter Madeline, who has special needs. Jocelyn says FEMA later helped pay for a hotel room, but the family had to move back into the house before it was repaired.
We then came back to the house the way it was. My children kept getting sick a lot because my baby girl suffers from asthma and her lungs don't work properly. My 8-year-old son also has asthma. I had to bring them to the doctor very often. He even gave me a letter so I can take it to FEMA because he said that our house was not livable. I spoke with FEMA and they told me that they could not pay for the hotel because my house was indeed livable.
Did the FEMA inspector come to the house?
El inspector de FEMA vino a la casa.
Yes, he did come to inspect, but he took only from 5 to 10 minutes. He was only here a few minutes. He was American and did not speak Spanish. So he came and only checked the front of the house. He didn't go to the bedrooms or the bathrooms. He didn't go anywhere.
When Jocelyn shows us the progress she and her husband have made so far, each room in her house looks about half ready to live in. Many windows are still being installed, including in the bedroom her children share. I ask her if she plans to keep living here, and she answers,
Yes, of course. I need to keep working to make money and keep going because we came here from our countries that are not as good as here to find a better future here. It is difficult, but not impossible.
Reporting in East Houston, I'm Renee Feltz for Democracy Now!
And Renee, finally, we have just 20 seconds, but FEMA's response to these immigrant homeowners, a number of them with U.S.-born children.
Well, these U.S.-born children are living in horrible conditions in some of the homes. It still smelled like mold when I went there. The mold is going away, but in many cases, there's no windows installed in their bedroom yet. These are, I wanted to distinguish, compared to other post-storm situations, these are longtime residents. Some of them have lived 5, 10, 20 years in Houston. They have U.S. citizens, so it's something that FEMA needs to address.
Well, we want to thank you for that excellent report. Renee Feltz, Democracy Now! Producer and reporter. And thanks to Chile Iglesias. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.